May 14th, 2026. We are in the 5th year, day 80 since the start of the full-scale invasion. Welcome to the Situation Report. Yes, here I am again. We're back, and we're looking at the situation reports, or rather the situation here in occupied Ukraine and around the world again. In today's report, we will look at many interesting things, but what we won't see are territorial gains. Even though I haven't made a situation report for 5 days now, well, there are still no territorial gains. There is hardly anything to report. Everything that happened here throughout the week, I can simply show you in 5 minutes during the live stream update on Sunday. The map of today's Russian attacks practically shows the complete reality of the war. Cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, swarms of drones, and all of that came flying toward Ukrainian cities from several directions at once. Kyiv was particularly affected again today, where residential buildings were hit and people were trapped under the rubble. According to Ukrainian sources, Russia used hundreds of drones and dozens of missiles in the past few hours. The attacks sometimes occurred in several waves. First, drones were used to overload the air defenses. After that, missile attacks targeted the same region. This pattern is becoming increasingly obvious. Reuters reports the heaviest Russian airstrikes. In total, more than 1,500 drones and dozens of missiles are said to have been used, even if a large portion is intercepted. By now, the sheer number is enough to cause damage in several regions at the same time. And this comes so soon after the ceasefire for Victory Day on the Russian side, when they were able to hold a more or less peaceful parade. And that's exactly why the Russian statement, "We want peace," sounds more and more hollow now. While Moscow publicly talks about negotiations continue while one of the war's most intense air campaigns unfolds. Residential buildings, energy supplies, railways, and entire city districts remain under constant alert. The actual strategy behind this seems clear. Russia is not only trying to inflict military damage, but also to permanently exhaust Ukrainian air defenses. Constant states of alert, attacks day and night, and ever-new waves of assaults are meant to wear down the system, technically, logistically, and above all, psychologically. That's exactly why these maps are now more than just small snapshots of the latest attacks. Above all, they show the attempt to force Ukraine into a permanent state of overload. And now the Russians are once again focusing on the capital. Meanwhile, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov has stated that a quick end to the war is possible, but only if Zelensky orders the Ukrainian army to lay down their arms and withdraw from the areas in Donbass claimed by Russia. With this, Moscow once again makes it clear that the Kremlin is still not talking about a real compromise, but is in fact demanding Ukrainian capitulation as a precondition for negotiations. Russia has long referred to occupied or partially controlled territories as its own state. Russia is causing this through political pressure. While there is ongoing international discussion about a ceasefire or possible peace talks, the Kremlin is simultaneously signaling that it will stick to its maximalist demands and will not give them up. This also shows that Moscow continues to view the war from a position of imperial entitlement, not as just any conflict that should be ended through mutual concessions. However, this stance is very risky for Russia, because the more obviously Moscow defines peace, in quotation marks of course, only under conditions of complete Ukrainian submission, the harder it becomes internationally to present the Kremlin as a serious negotiating partner. That's why the Russian line is getting more contradictory. On the one hand, Moscow constantly talks about diplomacy and negotiations. On the other hand, it sets conditions that are politically almost impossible for Kyiv to accept. And at the same time, there are also heavy airstrikes on Ukrainian cities to increase the pressure, possibly to influence a decision on the Ukrainian side, although I don't think the Ukrainians will really let themselves be influenced by that. I believe they'll prevent the Russians from gaining territory, especially not by Ukraine capitulating. Let's look at this on the map. In the end, this would mean that the Ukrainian army would have to withdraw mainly from this area, here in Kramatorsk, and would also have to give up Sloviansk, Dvropilya, and pull back to this line here. I'm following with the mouse here. That's where they would have to withdraw to and give up the entire area. Yes, but the Russians are suffering extreme losses. We'll get to that later because the U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has commented on this. commented on it, but as I said, we'll take another look at that in a moment. But we see that the Russians would conquer this area here, and that's in a region where they are suffering extremely heavy losses. At the same time, the Ukrainians would also lose the best defensive positions they currently have, because some of them are located here along the front, and another part here in the Zaporizhzhia region, which the Russians actually also claim but have not been able to fully capture. The Russians haven't fully captured any of these areas yet, despite repeatedly claiming they have. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense. The Ukrainian army would actually retreat into areas that are almost defenseless, and then it would only take a few days before the Russians launch their next attack, and attack from well-fortified positions. The Ukrainians wouldn't stand a chance anymore. We would see territorial gains here again. Just like in the past year, of course, the Russians want to trade that because they themselves know that they aren't making any progress here. I think it will take them at least another 5 to 10 years for the Donbass if things continue as they have, and for the whole of Ukraine, about 250 years. Ukrainian soldiers are trying to rescue a wounded comrade with the help of a UGV. The ground drone is used for transporting the wounded so that soldiers can be spared who would normally carry their comrade on a stretcher or an improvised stretcher. And if this UGV is hit, then only the wounded soldier would die, and not the comrades who were moving him. In this case, however, a Russian FPV drone waited for the moment of handover and took all the soldiers to their deaths. Rescuing wounded comrades also often involves dangers that can actually cause major problems in a matter of seconds. After the Ukrainian drone attack on the refinery in Perm, the facility has apparently completely ceased its operations. According to reports, several primary crude oil processing units were damaged, and other systems operating in emergency mode had to be shut down. Repairs could take weeks, maybe even years. Particularly relevant, the refinery is one of the largest in the country. If one of Russia's largest refineries has to completely stop operations after an attack, it creates real pressure on fuel production, logistics, and industrial supply. But even more important is the strategic impact behind it. Perm is 1,500 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. Such hits destroy the Russian narrative of a secure hinterland, because even remote industrial centers must now expect attacks. This poses a problem for the Kremlin, as refinery attacks have grown increasingly systematic over the past 6 weeks. The same facilities are attacked multiple times, prolonging production outages. Russia is forced to deploy more and more air defense and security resources deep within its own country. And that's exactly where their own weakness is now showing. Moscow oversees a vast territory and infrastructure, but can no longer protect it completely. Every successful attack on critical energy facilities makes it clear how overstretched and fragmented the Russian defense system has become. Now, Bashkortostan is also burning. Footage from Nolino shows massive fires at the local oil pumping and distribution station. At least one tank appears to have been completely destroyed. What's remarkable here is also the distance from Ukraine, just like before. The region is deep within Russian territory and has long been considered safe. So the war is increasingly spreading into the Russian hinterland. In the past, Moscow focused on securing the frontline areas, but today, industrial facilities hundreds of kilometers away suddenly have to expect drone attacks. Refineries, pumping stations, and distribution hubs can no longer all be protected simultaneously. Each new strike forces Moscow to move its defenses, and if they move their air defenses, they will be missing somewhere else. In the Kupiansk area in the Kharkiv region, a Ukrainian drone was able to locate and hit an improvised Russian ammunition depot that they had hidden in a large pipeline. The explosions indicate that both small boxes and larger amounts of ammunition were stored there. What's notable isn't just the single hit, but what this reveals about the depots in this part of the front. Russian units are still hiding supplies in improvised shelters, pipes, or abandoned pieces of infrastructure, which can be discovered quite easily. Open depots are rarely left undetected by drones now, and those drones are also used to carry out attacks. As Anstekin said, drones have become very powerful. Of course, this works for the Ukrainian side as well, and this has a major impact on frontline logistics. Even small ammunition depots have to be hidden, because any discovered location can be attacked within a short time. But the fact is, the soldiers at the front naturally need more ammunition than what they can carry on them, and that makes the situation even more dramatic, because if even these small depots can be discovered and attacked, then even resupply itself is hardly safe anymore. In this small area which borders on micromanagement, it's no longer really safe. Especially in the Kupiansk area, this is extremely relevant, because there has been a really tough war of attrition going on there for months. If even ammunition can only be stored provisionally, it makes supplying, coordinating, and stabilizing Russian attacks along the front much more difficult. Let's move on to an interesting statement by U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, because he explains that the Ukrainian armed forces are now the strongest and most battle-hardened army in Europe. And in fact, this statement is less surprisingly exaggerated than it sounds at first glance. Hardly any other military on this continent has experienced a comparable intensity of modern warfare in recent years. Ukraine is constantly fighting under real combat conditions, with drone warfare, artillery duels, electronic warfare, and highly dynamic frontline logistics. While many European armies only simulate such scenarios, the Ukrainian army experiences them every day. In addition, there is the enormous attrition on the Russian side. He also says that the Russians lose 5 times more soldiers every month than the Ukrainians do. So if Russia really has to cope with such high losses of nearly 1,000 soldiers a day, it shows, on the one hand, that the Ukrainians are losing 200 soldiers, while it also shows how brutal and resource-intensive this war has become. The fact that Ukraine has been able to withstand a military superpower under such conditions for years inevitably changes the military balance of power in Europe. And Europe, of course, without Europe and without the EU and without NATO, Ukraine would not be where it is today. But you also have to say, we haven't given much. If you look at it in percentage terms, we could have given much more. And even with this small part that we've given, comparatively speaking, Ukraine continues to hold out against a great power like Russia. For Moscow, this is just as problematic because the Kremlin originally wanted to portray Ukraine as a weak neighbor that would collapse within a few days. Today, even Washington itself says that the strongest fighting force in Europe has emerged there. That development alone is already a strategic challenge, a defeat for Putin's original war goals, which still have not been achieved. Footage from the Russian Pacific base now shows submarines covered with anti-drone nets. Just a few years ago, this image would have been almost unimaginable. Normally, submarines and their bases are considered highly protected strategic systems, not targets that need to be secured with nets against cheap drones. Russia now seems to use improvised protection for parts of its strategic fleet. That shows how seriously Moscow now takes the threat. After all, such nets are not created out of strength or routine. They are put in place because the military accepts that traditional protection systems alone are no longer sufficient. Drones have changed the cost logic of war. Multi-million-dollar projects like warships or submarines suddenly have to be protected against comparatively cheap drones. And psychologically, that's a delicate issue for Russia. The Navy is actually supposed to symbolize power projection and control. When even submarines are hidden under nets in the harbor, it creates the image of a military that constantly has to patch up new weaknesses. In Kherson, vehicles of a humanitarian UN mission were apparently attacked with FPV drones. According to Zelensky, it hit a convoy of the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. The heads of the mission and key staff were in the vehicle, but no one was injured. What is particularly significant is not the attack itself, but rather the type of system that was used. Drones are directly controlled and provide the operator with a live feed. That means the attackers were very likely able to see exactly which vehicle they were attacking. That's precisely why the incident is likely to attract international attention, or so you would think. But this isn't the first case. Especially in the Kherson area, this is at least the 7th case I've read about where vehicles from a UN mission have been attacked. And it's always by drones. Even though these are actually clearly identifiable civilian actors, and when such missions come under drone fire, the perception of the war shifts even further toward complete breakdown of all restraints. And even though the whole thing should actually be politically risky, from Moscow's perspective, it still seems to pose no problem for them to carry out something like this, because they expect no consequences, and anyone who expects no consequences has still not been put under enough pressure. Thanks to all subscribers, channel members, and the Alga crew. Special thanks to Uberslot, Renakis, Lieutenant Colonel Renakis, and Relativ Tick Ferdinand Meyerhofer. Subscribe, like, comment, and see you in the next report.